Hello, and thank you all for joining us for this second Think Circle roundtable discussion. By connecting bright minds and big ideas, we aim to find solutions to build a more sustainable future. I am Maria Wetterstrand, and I will act as your host and discussion moderator today. This time, we will examine how using better regulation can help deliver the EU's Green Deal. The overarching aim of the European Green Deal is for the European Union to become the world's first climate-neutral bloc by 2050, and circular economy plays a key role in achieving this goal. To achieve those goals and openly address the issues, challenges, and opportunities we face in the pursuit of circularity, we all need to work together. Huhtamaki has established this Think Circle platform to support this kind of collaboration. No one organization has all the answers. No one company can do this alone. We all must work across the value chain, learn from one another, drive a common understanding of sustainability, and act together to come up with solutions. This common understanding can also help us to design better regulation to support sustainability, with focus not only on the quick wins. The EU Commission is in the process right now of making changes to what's called the Better Regulation Agenda, which aims at improving the process of decision-making and policy proposals. And this makes our conversation today quite timely. So, setting ambitious goals is one thing. Finding the right tools and incentives to get there is another. Our focus is on better regulation. What are the best tools to ensure rapid progress, while also encouraging investment in innovation and cooperation across the value chain? How do we make sure that regulation supports the creation of best environmental options and avoid unintended consequences? Before today's event, we conducted interviews with our panelists to gain a broader perspective to better regulation. The articles are now available at www.think-circle.com, and today we have the honor to hear from our experts and engage in an open dialogue with them. There are different ways in which decision makers can deliver the Green Deal, and today's conversations and articles we have published will compare and contrast the viewpoints of various stakeholders and how the EU should be creating legislation to support the Green Deal goals. And as we talk here, please don't hesitate to leave questions and comments in the Q&A box on the right-hand side of the video stream. Remember to join the discussion on social media as well with the hashtag ThinkCircle. So, we have 6 panelists today, and I will let them speak introductory round here. And the first one on the floor is Dr. Lorenzo Allio, who is the Senior Policy Analyst at European Regulation and Innovation Forum. Welcome, Lorenzo. The floor is yours. You have said that regulators should be thinking as much about the how when crafting better regulation as the what. Can you elaborate a little bit on these fundamental principles behind legislation, please?
Thank you. Yes, with pleasure. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you very much for having me and inviting the European Regulation Innovation Forum. It's very much what you highlighted in your precise introduction. The what is the ambitious and quite important and needed objectives and targets set out by the Green Deal, but it's very much important to find the most appropriate ways to achieve them. That is the how I was referring to. And here it's crucial to steadily keep better regulation at the core of decision making, even more so than in the past, possibly. And maybe just to kick off the discussion, we could highlight 3 dimensions to go along with this imperative of better regulation. The first one is to put increased attention on the coherence. And here I mean the coherence not only between policy objectives and the various strategies of the Green Deal, but also coherence from the policy design down to the implementation of the very regulations that are developed, so across the decision-making process. The second dimension that hopefully we will touch upon during the discussion is evidence, the role of evidence, and an important element to stress is quality. And the third dimension I wanted to highlight is proportionality. And here, I think we should insist on the causality and the proof of the need for intervention, the way it is designed. So basing measures on risk, and then also considering the overarching overall impacts that proposed measures are going to produce. So if we tackle these three dimensions, I think that there are higher chances that the Green Deal measures will be more effective, that there will be more confidence by all stakeholders in seeing the EU is truly front runner in in this global transition. And thirdly, and not least, is that it would enhance the consent of the taxpayers and the consumers, because there are costs associated to this transition that need to be considered. So I think these three, effectiveness, confidence, and consent, are actually the drivers, but also the benefits for engaging much more with better regulation for the Green Deal. I've stopped here, but I will be happy to, of course, enter in details with colleagues in the discussion. Thank you.
Yes, we look forward to hearing more about these thoughts later on. We will move on to our next panelist. Thank you so much, Lorenzo. Now we will listen to Patrick ten Brink, who is the Deputy Secretary General at the European Environmental Bureau, one of the most influential NGOs in Brussels. Welcome, Patrick. Very nice to have you here. You have raised the point that better regulation needs to evolve in light of the European Green Deal, what you call the sustainability first principle. Can you expand a little bit on this, please?
Yes, yes, sure, and thank you very much for the opportunity to join you and to speak. I mean, taking one step back, I mean, if you look at the history of better regulation, it comes and has been inspired very much by a sort of a deregulation approach imported from the UK and from the States, influenced by the tobacco and the oil industry. And the last 10, 15 years, the better regulation has been focusing on some aspects of deregulation, but also really focusing on avoiding additional or excess burdens. And I think this approach has basically led to a focus on short-term economic costs in the analysis. And I think now, with an understanding of all the challenges we face and the commitments of the Green Deal, I think we need to revisit this and say, well, is it short-term economic burdens that really should be the primacy and focus of better regulation, or should it be about achieving our objectives properly? And so I just want to bring out a few elements here. The first is, I think we need to have a sort of a Green Deal compatibility check with all new legislation to say, are we actually going to contribute to this commitment? And similarly, this could also be done for existing legislation. And if there's cases of incoherence, then maybe they should be targeted for refit discussions. And similarly, at the moment in the mission letters, and part of better regulation is the one in, one out principle, which seeks to basically mean that no additional burdens are added without others reducing, so there's no net gain. I think this needs to go out because it doesn't make any sense on its own purposes. Each legislation should be looked at on its own merits and not with some sort of artificial political picture. A key thing is, if we use a calculator, we need to fix and it's broken, we should either get a new calculator or to fix it. And so this builds on Lorenzo's points about data methods. If you look at the way impact assessments are used for all the legislation, you find that there's a sort of an implicit and accidental bias in some cases towards short-term economic costs. Some of the methods don't allow important things like feedback loops or non-linearities to be picked up. A lot of issues aren't picked up, like some health issues, some things that cannot be monetized, environmental impacts and system change effects. So in the end, you have a result which is suboptimal. So the calculator doesn't actually add in all the right numbers to get to the answer and represent the whole picture. So we should look at the data. And so by improving the data and making sure we have the whole picture, we should move towards a sustainability first check rather than one which is focused on short-term economic goals. In addition, there's the Green Oath, which is really good, which has been committed to. The Green Oath is do no harm, and that should be implemented, of course, but the Green Oath of do no harm is a defensive principle. We don't want to be defensive. We have a future to build, so we want to have a positive agenda of do good. And one other issue with respect to the things that are often missing in assessment, just to jump back, often the possibility of future industries, the benefits for future industries is ignored in the assessment. The possibilities for low and zero risk alternatives are not necessarily always factored in. So while I'm talking from an environmental sustainability perspective, the benefits should also be there for a business perspective. So this gets the last 2 points very quickly. We need a principle of transparency to be applied systematically on the decisions, but also in the legislation. So, for example, when it comes to legislation, we need to make sure that we know what chemicals are used in our products, or else we don't know how to use them. And finally, we need to make sure that the incentives are right and that the vanguard companies are not disabused. So we should look at ensuring a level playing field that is a race to the top and a race to the bottom. The only way we do that is by actually recognizing the wider benefits that innovative companies can make for the Green Deal, rather than playing a defensive game of trying to stick with yesterday's agenda. So I'll stop there, and I'll pick up some other bits later. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much, Patrick. So our next panelist is Fatma Sahin from the European External Affairs Manager at Unilever. Welcome, Fatma. It's very nice to have you here. You talk about the role of incentives versus bans in decision making. Can you elaborate a little bit on what kinds of situations where each of these might be the appropriate way to achieve the best outcome?
Yes, first of all, good afternoon to you and everyone else, and also thank you for inviting me here to take part in this panel. So when it comes to measures, banning or incentives, I would say when it comes to legislative measures to ensure environmental outcomes, there is no one-size-fits-all solutions. So best approach would be actually the combination of restrictive measures like banning and providing at the same time incentives to help to achieve the goal and the objectives of a particular regulation. So if I can give an example, well, plastics is a hot topic at the moment. For example, if we want to ban a certain polymer or plastic without having any alternative in place, it is not going to help to ensure the shift to a more sustainable material, for example. This is the same when we are setting targets to increase the uptake of recycled plastic. The measures need to be combined with incentives. For example, financially, to ensure that there is money to invest in building the right infrastructure, for example, waste management, and that we have a competitive pricing for new recycled materials such as between virgin plastic and recycled plastic, for example. So it becomes also affordable to many more companies, and not only for those big ones that can actually afford to purchase recycled plastics. And in terms of policy, it is also essential that there is certainty provided when we look at which recycling processes are accepted and recognized, but also to ensure that legislation is future-proof. So to Patrick's point, we also have to look into the future to take into account innovation, for example. These are key elements if we want to make a shift to more greener economy.
So thank you very much. One person who has been speaking a lot about innovation is Alexandre Affre he is from Business Europe, where he is the Deputy Director General. And welcome, Alexandre. You said that every decision made should be driven by the principle of making Europe more innovative. Can you please reflect on this a little bit further?
Yeah, thank you. And it's very good transition with the last few words from Fatma, because she was finishing with innovation, and I would like very much to highlight this. And this is where I come from very much when I'm discussing about the better regulation. We need Europe to be more innovative, more because even if there are differences according to sectors, we see that Europe is sometimes lagging behind. So we need more innovation. And we, of course, need innovation because of the big societal challenges that we are facing, which includes, of course, the Green Deal and the climate ambition. And we know that if we talk about climate neutrality, this is also very much a technological agenda, not only, but very much a technological agenda where many of the technologies are there, but many more needs to be developed. And that's why I think I come to the second part about the link with better regulation. We need, of course, the financing. This is one part. The other part is about how you design best legislations, climate legislations, to be more enabling and easing the innovation that are coming from companies. And on this, and we can discuss more, of course, during the panel, but there are certain points like making sure that legislations do not become too prescriptive, but you leave space for companies to develop new ideas and bring new ideas. You also have to look at making sure and minimize the compliance cost for certain legislations. And this is where I make a quick link with a remark by Patrick before. I think when he was talking about short-term economic cost, I think what we need to keep in mind is what the money companies spend now in terms of compliance cost. It's money they spend less on R&D and possible future innovations. And that is very much about the future. And so we should not today preempt being innovative tomorrow, which is, of course, key for tackling climate change.
Thank you very much. That's a good point, of course. We will get back to that as well later. The next speaker is Thomasine Kamerling, who represents Huhtamaki, where she is the Executive Vice President, Sustainability and Communications. So welcome, Thomasine. You are talking a lot about collaboration, and that's one of the reasons why we are having this roundtable discussion. So to achieve a truly sustainable circular way of doing business, we need collaboration. And you have introduced 4 key elements to drive this change. Can you please explain them to us?
Thank you, Maria, and thank you all for joining us today on what promises to be a riveting discussion. So the 4 points we make are actually very much linked to what has already been said, which is a good thing, which means that we can find consensus and move forward. The first one is around the concept of needing an infrastructure revolution. So we have to start looking at where the gaps are across member states, across regions, across cities and so forth. So it's not good enough for a product to be recyclable. It has to be recycled. And those infrastructures need to be set up. And this is really looking at whether it's the waste management or recycling systems, but it is also across other areas and requires us doing an audit and revolutionizing the way we think about this. The second point that I'd like to put across is, and has been touched on by colleagues on this call already, is this concept around empowering transformative innovation. How do you future-proof for the future? How do you create an environment which is going to incentivize innovation, is going to look at innovation in a completely different way, which is ultimately agnostic in terms of technology and material. So we need policies that support innovation and that drive competitive sustainability. And perhaps one caveat there is the sustainability agenda and the green agenda is all about opportunity. And I think that's beholden on us is to consistently focus on that opportunity and that horizon scanning in terms of what is possible and how we really can make Europe competitive in this area. The third point is around consumers and consumer behavior. We have to incentivize consumers to change. They are as much a part of this as industry is, as academia is, and so forth. So we need to encourage consumers to reuse, repair, and recycle. And there we know that education and inspiration, so that big picture in terms of innovation play a really, really important role. And then the fourth one is around this concept of evidence-based policy making. So using the life cycle thinking. And I think it was Patrick who mentioned this point around not just looking at the economic impact. I think we need to look at it from the ESG perspective. So it's environmental, it's social, it's governance. Or another analogy of it is looking at it the way pharma looks in terms of real world data. So there is no decision that just sits on its own. You have to look at the life cycle. You've got to look at it from a life cycle assessment and look at the impact that it has, whether that in some cases is unintended or actually it is not as you expected it to be, and what that then means. And I'll stop there and we'll leave the rest for conversations later on.
Thank you, Thomasine. We have one representative of decision makers here on the panel today, and that's Henna Virkkunen, who is the member of the European Parliament for the EPP group. And you are the only one actually from the decision maker side here. You have said that environmental issues, when it comes to those, that EU should set targets and then leave large room for the industrial sectors to figure out how to achieve those. Can you please explain how you think concerning these issues, please?
Yeah, thank you, Maria, and thank you for Huhtamaki for organizing this. I think very interesting seminar. I already heard so many inspiring speeches in the first round. And I already heard that the decision makers should not only think that what, but also how. And of course, I can agree that when we are setting the targets, it's important to know that we can achieve them, that it should be possible. There we have to think that how also, but not, I think, not too deeply, because if I take an example from the transport sector, where I have been working quite much in the European Parliament, there we have very ambitious goals that we have to really much now cut the emissions. But I think it's important that we are not choosing the technologies. We should be very technology neutral, because there is multiple solutions. There is biogas, renewable fuels, electricity, hydrogen, maybe new technologies coming up. So I think it's important that we are setting the target, but then the industry, they will find out that what is the most efficient way to achieve the targets. And also, of course, we have in transport sector, we have many modes of transport, and we have very different regions in Europe. So there's different possibilities in different areas how to solve these challenges. So that's why I think it's important that we keep technology neutral when we are making decisions, because we shouldn't choose the winners and losers. We should set the targets. But of course, they have to be realistic, and we have to have the knowledge that it's possible for the industry to reach these targets.
Thank you very much, Henna, and thank you everyone in the panel for these introductory round comments. Now we will move on to the more round table discussion. So welcome everyone, and let's continue on the topics that you already mentioned during your introductions. First, maybe I would like to ask if the first speakers have any comments on the last ones. So I will let Lorenzo and Patrick possibly comment on if there is something that came to your minds while listening. Lorenzo.
Thank you, Maria. It's very much insightful, everything that has been said, and I could agree on most of the points. Maybe reiterating a couple of issues. For instance, just one that picks my brain now is the issue of transparency, which is very important. Transparency both in terms of, for instance, when it comes to risk assessment or safety assessment studies, put in the public domain the documentation, the scientific findings, and so on is very important. But also should be very clear also to the public why certain studies have been chosen or to support, to underpin decision, why other studies have been discarded. And one issue that maybe could be further enhanced in the current governance of regulatory science at EU level, that stimulates also predictability, that stimulates this proportionality discussion on risk that we were discussing, is really to establish and enforce criteria for the quality of the studies, for the quality of the scientific expertise, and also which experts are actually being brought in to advise the regulators. And this is something that, for instance, we have put forward on the agenda, and because science is one of the key factors when it comes to innovation. This is just one that I wanted. I don't want to monopolize the discussion. The other one is the issue of anticipating future outcomes or future technological advances, which is intrinsic in the notion of innovation, and how, for instance, the currently an increasing use of the notion of essential use actually fits with this notion, because if we are now at present in a position to say this will be an essential use or will not be essential, we are less on the side of evidence, but more in the foresight that might be a bit misleading and actually trigger unintended consequences.
Thank you. Patrick, do you have any comments on this?
Yes, please. Yeah, I got three. One is a comment on agreement. One is a challenge to one thing that's said, and one is a compliment. So on agreement, I think what I was heartened is that I think all of us have broadly the same objective in mind. I mean, we want to have, by the time we get to 2050, an industry which is competitive and vibrant, and there well-being for people and a planet that's resilient and in good shape. The differences may be just in the way we want to get there. So that's my point of agreement. In my point of disagreement, it's on the issue of innovation, and that regulation is basically a brake on innovation because the money gets sapped away from R&D, and that's a point from Alexandre. Here, I think if you look at legislation, it's actually a driver for innovation. If you look at the Eco-Design Directive, the Industrial Emissions Directive, cars and CO2 legislation, each of these things have encouraged legislation. Of course, it costs money, but some of these things you get the money back from the citizens at the end. So I think really we should look more at what actually are real drivers and brakes of regulation, of innovation. And we find that maybe it is good to have regulation. It is good to complement it then with incentives. And then if I pick that up in terms of the complementarity on the incentives, I fully agree there should be positive incentives for infrastructure and other issues to ensure that it's recycled and not just recyclable. But there's another dimension to the issue of incentives, and that is about non-compliance fees and fines at one level. And the reason I mention this is because sometimes the laggard or companies can have an easier ride if there's no dissuasive fees and fines. You can look in cases of illegal waste dumping in the UK, for example, illegal minerals extraction in certain countries, and this. It's not just an environmental issue, it also makes it life difficult for the vanguard companies. And what I was trying to do earlier is to say we want to raise to the top. We want businesses who really wish to innovate, to motivate and be the leaders, to not be undermined by poor legislation or poor compliance with legislation in other countries. So you also need to look at the issue of incentives for non-compliance and strengthen that. So the good in each of these, like at Businesses Europe, the good players in your organization are not undermined by the laggards. And then one last thing on incentives, there's lots of clever tools, and with respect to extended producer responsibility, some countries are doing interesting things with fee modulation. And I think there we need to look at the diversity of practice and say which ones work and how, learn from the experimentation in different places and say, okay, this can really help give the incentives to push the material use in the way we wish it to be, complemented by the issues of transparency to make sure it's the right materials that are supported and not the wrong ones. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I've been thinking a little bit about this concept of better regulation. I mean, of course, no one would oppose having better regulation. It's sort of self-evident. But obviously, it's still a discussion on how this is supposed to be achieved. And that must mean that there are some challenges in how it's done today. And I would like to hear a little bit more of examples of where these challenges today really are. How come it is not supporting innovation, and how come it's not good enough for the companies or the other actors as it is today? I would like to hear, Alexandre, maybe you would like to comment also on what Patrick said about this focus on innovation and regulations.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. No, I think it's an interesting discussion, of course, and not an easy one. So a couple of thinking here. I think what this is probably where we can all agree as well, what we are looking for is good and smart regulations. What we put behind the words, this is where maybe we come from different background and we have different interpretations. But what my point is very much about Europe should design very smart regulations in order to be a real incentive of making Europe more innovative and of innovation. And by saying this, I think it is clear that we need regulation in order to set an objective, in order to define possibly milestones, how you reach that objective. But how the regulations are designed is really key, and you can certainly have. This is what I was talking before, and I think several talked about technological sovereignty, talk about essential goods. I mean, the way you design your regulations, you can be quite prescriptive in certain technologies, certain design of goods, certain products that should be allowed or not. And this is where it sometimes becomes a bit tricky also from a business perspective, because you are reducing the possibilities to bring new ideas and new product, new technologies on the market. So this is where I think this is where things needs to be very well balanced. And I when I was commenting first, I was not commenting. Of course, each regulation brings cost and administrative compliance cost, and this we business have to accept this. Still, I think it's a fair point to say, as much as possible, in order to have smart regulation, you have to minimize this, to also make sure that as much as possible, companies are able to invest in research and innovation that will bring the solutions we need to tackle the main challenges like climate change. So I think this is really because I don't want to be misunderstood, and I think this is really a key point for me that is well understood in this discussion.
Thank you. Fatma, you talk a lot about the time schedules and the coherence between different policy initiatives in your interview that's published online in the Think Circle website. Can you please give an example of where this lack of coherence and the time schedule not sort of aligning with each other causes problems for you?
Yes, I mean, lately we are facing some legislation that are proposed looking only at one aspect without taking into account, for example, other aspects that are needed. So we do need coherence if we look at the whole policy making as well. An example, for example, is, yes, I don't want to talk about it, but I will raise it. It's the Single-Use Plastics Directive, which will enter into force in July. And we are still waiting for the guidelines on the scope to be published, which are going to set the definitions even of what plastic is and to which products it will apply. But it also contains, for example, a provision for the uptake of recycled content in beverage bottles. This is set by 25% in 2025. However, we are struggling as Unilever within Europe to find sufficient quality, I mean good quality recyclates to have it in our packaging. But at the same time, we are still waiting also for the Commission to publish the approvals of certain PET mechanical recycling processes. And this has been years at the moment, and it's still not published. And this is essential that we get clarity, as I also mentioned in the beginning, clarity and also certainty on what kind of processes are allowed. So these, they can also work and provide, let's say, the supply needed for the uptake. This is one of the lacks, I think. Therefore, we also say it has to be coherent. Cooperation, not only between companies and industries, but also between the policymakers, the different departments, when they come with legislation, to make sure that they are aligned, that they look at the timelines as well, and maybe also be inclusive, take the value chain into account. I think it's only together that we can come with solutions and really ensure there is systemic change. And I think that's one of the challenges as well when you look at circular economy. It's not just tackling one actor of the chain. That will not help. So we need solutions for all, and especially work together and make sure it's all aligned as well.
Thank you so much. One other issue that's been mentioned a lot, both in the introductory comments and in the interviews, is the question of evidence-based decision making. And of course, already today, there are a lot of expert groups involved in preparing decisions. There are open feedback and consultations, and there are a lot of sort of material and persons behind all the proposals that are put on the table. But still, many comment that it's not enough evidence-based. Thomasine, I know you have been thinking a lot about this issue. Could you please elaborate a little bit on what kind of problems you see with the current processes and how it's done?
Thank you. Well, I think simply put, sometimes you just don't know, and you don't know what you're looking for. So even how you set up the evidence base and the data, and I think this was referred to earlier, already drives the results. But I think what we've been seeing, and this is very much, again, to name the SUPD, but we did, EPA did, which is the Association for Packaging, commissioned Ramble to do a life cycle assessment. So really to look at it from a very holistic perspective. And it found effectively a counterintuitive, counter-perceptive analysis, which is that single use actually has less of a carbon footprint than multi-use, completely against what you would expect it to be, perhaps from a societal point of view. And I think this is the point that we make around evidence-based, data-driven decisions, which is you have to do the analysis, you've got to do it across the life cycle. And to Fatma's point, it's not just one part of it. You really do have to look, if you want to have a circular economy, you've got to look at it circularly and not linearly. And so you have to take in considerations. It might look better here, but what does it look like from a CO2 footprint? What does it look like from a social perspective, and so forth? And I think this is, the reason we're having this conversation. I know, as we've all said, we're all in violent agreement about the need for better regulation and our objectives of a cleaner, better environment and a green economy and a recovery and so forth. How we get there, it is really complicated because there's so many different parts to this, and no one has the answer. So when we look at the SUPD and we look at parliaments, there isn't at the moment a viable environmental alternative. So we need, as an industry, then to be given the space and the enablement, the empowerment in a way to put the investment to develop that innovation, knowing that if we don't do it within a certain amount of time, things will happen, which is Patrick's point as well. So I think it is always a little bit of the carrot and the stick, but you have to give that, you've got to give the boost to the innovation. And the potential to create the framework to be able to do that, knowing that if we don't get it right, someone else may come up with a great idea. We should be looking much more at digitalization. We know that's part of the green recovery. So what does that actually mean? And how do we use that? And that's where my initial point was, we need to be agnostic about the material, the technology, and even the sector. How are we not learning from other sectors across the industry as well? We should be.
Thank you. I will soon give the floor to you, Henna, to comment on these issues that you've listened to now. But I will just ask Lorenzo to just say a few words on something that you mentioned in your interview, which is that you would like to see some kind of EU-wide law on administrative procedure, like the Administrative Procedures Act in the US, so that we would ensure that the process always takes into account all the important stakeholders, I guess, and knowledge that is on the table. Can you say a little bit about this, please?
Yes, sure. It comes from the acknowledgement that contrary to what typically we think, and we are also taught, for instance, when we study European decision making, the decision making actually is no longer linear, meaning the European Commission has the right of initiative. You have the two co-legislators, and then member state implements European law. But you have a feedback loop, and the implementation actually increasingly takes place centrally through EU agencies, EU bodies, expert groups, in an administrative context. And this is especially the case when it comes to risk regulation. Now, the better regulation agenda of the European Commission and overall of the European institutions pretty much covers quite well, the OECD also testified this, the legislative process. But when it comes to this administrative, at our think tank, we call it administrative state, the implementation phase of risk regulation, then good regulatory principles and practices are not necessarily applied. So we have difficulties in terms of transparency, participatory rights, both from NGOs and industry. We have unclarity of the grounds upon which decisions are made, whether they are political, they are based on evidence, to which extent one overlaps or has the upper hand over the other. And the not necessarily impact assessment are carried out with the same rigor and are scrutinized with the same rigor, or if at all. So a law of administrative procedure, which actually is also present in the majority of member states, would ensure that there are then set on paper legally binding procedural standards that the EU institutions should abide by. And the European Parliament, for instance, has come up with a resolution in this respect, which the European Commission has not yet considered to put forward.
Thank you. Henna, when you listen to the comments from the participants in this discussion here, and you also think about the unintended consequences that EU regulation sometimes can have for the individual actors, certain industries, how can this be better taken into consideration in decision making, in your point of view? If your microphone is not on, please turn it on.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. That is very, I think, good and difficult question. Also, I think we heard already many very important points and also ideas how we could develop the process. And I think one of the biggest challenges from the industry's view in the European legislation is that often the existing solutions, they are not taken in account when the regulation is made. And that's why I think it's important that we are listening to stakeholders during the whole process. And now there is a lot of pressure towards European Commission on this better regulation and the processes, how Commission is working. And I think it's important that they are doing very careful impact assessment and they are listening stakeholders and having this public consultation, listening very wide-ranging stakeholders. But of course, it's just the start of the process when the Commission is publishing their proposal, because after that, what is happening in the European Parliament and also in the European Council or in the Council and in the trialogues, yes, it's a good question how evidence-based all the decisions are, or how much there is different political pressure and different compromises. And often the outcome is some kind of Christmas tree after all these compromises which are made during the process. So I think it's we already heard good ideas how we could make the whole regulation process much better than it is now. And it's sure that it's not transparent at all now how the legislation is finalized in all these negotiations.
At the same time, in the end, there are the politicians who decide on what priorities there should be, and I guess that's how things should work as well in a democracy. And sometimes you wouldn't agree, probably even if you had the exact full knowledge about everything. So I guess that there could still be differences in political opinion and interpretation afterwards. Or what do you say, Henna?
This is the case, so we can, of course, listen different experts and researchers and have all kind of evidence, but then if the politicians, they just want to decide somehow, then the decision will be that. So it's of course also always up to values, what there is behind the decision makers, what kind of decisions we will have.
We have received a question from the audience as well here. We have talked a lot here in the panel about how regulation should be developed to better achieve the objectives of the politicians and the citizens and the industries. So if you could choose one thing to make it better, what would be your choice? And if you could all give a quick and short comment on that, I would appreciate it very much. How about we start with Alexandre, because you also raised your hand before, so maybe you wanted to comment on something else as well.
Yeah, thank you. I'll answer your question. Before, I wanted to comment about something I think Lorenzo was mentioning, so super brief, but I think when it comes to the impact assessment and how we shape legislations to make them very supportive of innovation, let's keep in mind tools exist. You have something called an innovation tool in the impact assessment process. It's there. This is a lack of implementation across the different legislation. So I think using the existing tools to make sure that legislations help as much as possible innovation, I think it's a matter of implementation, what already exists. And then on your point, because I didn't comment before on this one, I'd like to highlight, the transparency. But I think for me, the transparency very much when it comes to this is what Ms. Virkkunen was mentioning, I think when it comes to the final trilogue negotiations, because this is where, of course, politicians need to make decisions, but when it's about bringing quite substantial new amendments, here we need more transparency for stakeholders to have information before the final decisions are made.
Thank you. Fatma, can you give a comment to what is the most important thing to develop when it comes to better regulation?
I think I will still say a proper evidence-based, so more robust science, but also cooperation. I think these are essential. So ensure that we are, as said before, I mean, not only just transparency, but also that the actual cooperation takes place and proper impact assessments as well. And not rushing through maybe, but taking the time. I know it's sometimes essential and we need to speed up the efforts. The time is running, but we really, I mean, it's about the future. We're talking about the planet. We need to be careful what kind of measures we put in place and ensure that it's not getting worse.
Thank you. That sounds reasonable, really. Patrick.
Yes, thanks. I'll cheat and put 3 in a sentence. First of all, I think we need ambition because we need transformative change. Just like Fatma just mentioned, we need fairness to make sure the whole picture is picked up. That includes understanding industry's concern, not just the planet's concern, but fairness to understand the whole picture. And then we need it to be implementable and enforceable. If it can't be implemented, you're just going to have non-compliance. If it can't be enforced, it's not going to be compliant, and you actually lose trust in the whole institutions and governance process. So I'd go for ambitious, fair, implementable, and enforceable. That's 4 in one sentence. Sorry.
Okay, but you were quite short, so it's okay. Thomasine.
Yeah, I'm coming behind these ideas, which I all agree with completely. So all of the above. The one other I would say is, and it's about the ambition, is creating incentivization. So better regulation should incentivize for better outcomes.
Sorry, but can I ask you, because it's a lot of talk about incentives, can you give an example of a good incentive?
So it could be a good or a bad, but a good incentive is the extended producer responsibility and how it's worked. I think that if you look at recycling in Finland and Germany, they've got some programs that have worked really, really well. So it goes back to the initial comment I had about the carrot and the stick, but the incentivization should also be around innovation. So I think apologies, I can't remember in whose article it was, but there was the idea of public procurement around innovation and green innovation. And how a small percentage of that happens, that's an incentivization. So investment funding for innovation is fantastic. Doing it with others is even better because we know that we'll get better answers. So that collaboration, cooperation approach, partnership approach across the value chain for the EU would be, I think, a win-win.
Yeah, thank you. That makes it much clearer so that the audience doesn't think only that, yeah, here, give us a lot of your taxpayers' money, because that's not what you mean. So I just wanted to make that clear. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Lorenzo.
Well, all of the above is the answer. So the one that I would pick is absolutely vital, and I agree with the colleagues. I would stress again proportionality, but proportionality in the truly sense of the word, which is ensuring that you have a commitment to show that there is a necessity to intervene. There is also a commitment to understand the overarching impacts, and so these dynamic second order impacts, which reflect unintended consequences, we named risk, which reflects distributional and social adjustment costs, which are very important in a transition as big as the Green Deal, but also incentives to innovation and how private investors, especially because these are the ones that put down 85% of R&D in Europe at the moment, actually decide to allocate investments in R&D. And also understanding the pace and the diffusion of new technologies, these disruptive technologies that we are aiming at, but acknowledging also that incremental innovation is very much needed and very promising in European context, because a lot of the industrial fabric of Europe builds upon incremental innovation, and we have to understand the dynamics that lead to that improvement. So this is encapsulated in my understanding of proportionality.
Thank you. And Henna, if you would choose one improvement proposal.
Yeah, I think also that our legislation should be always very innovation friendly, and we should really focus to that angle when we are setting regulation. But I think one thing to what we should develop is really this impact assessment, and we should have it during the whole legislation process. So now we are very much focusing to Commission's part of it, but also in the Parliament, I think there is more need to really focus to that, what kind of impacts those decisions and those amendments, what different members are tabling, what kind of impacts they would have.
Yes, thank you very much. One thing that you touched upon in your interview, several of you, was this conflict between voluntary initiatives and commitments from industry versus regulations and restrictions, and maybe also taxation and those kind of measures that might be from the political side a little bit more sort of stick rather than carrot, so to say. Fatma, you were one of those who mentioned this in your interview, how to balance between these two perspectives. Can you give us some insight into how you reason about these things?
I think voluntary actions are really key, also mentioned previously by some others as well. So, I mean, in a way, with voluntary action, you can also check what is possible, how can we get there? And what you need from legislators is actually an enabling policy. They can set standards and also incentives, but to see like what the best way is to get there, that can be done voluntary. Because then we can cooperate with the whole value chain, seek for solutions, but also identify what are the obstacles. And there might be need for legislation sometimes as well to help the industry to make the shift. But this is something we need to assess, and sometimes it's too premature to commit legislation, and it can be very restrictive, especially when we already said several times when it comes to innovation, for example, because technology is developing really fast. So in order to see what solution is best is sometimes to look at best practices. And then at a certain point, we can commit legislation and also to ensure, for example, level playing field. But it has to be something, again, a combination of measures.
Of course, there would be no development at all if no industries tried to develop something new and take voluntary action. So then it wouldn't be possible to have more strong regulations either. So I guess it somehow must go hand in hand. But Patrick, you seem to be a little bit more skeptic in your interview when it comes to industry solving these things by voluntary action.
Sure. I'm a bit biased because I wrote a book about this about 15 years ago.
Okay.
But I see voluntary agreements as good from a point of view of experimentation, exploration, and I think they're very helpful, and they can open ways up. And if you look at the past, sometimes they've had a very good bridging function. So they've been applied for a number of years. You've learned certain lessons. You've developed an evidence base to show what works, doesn't work, also whether motivation is high enough. And then it's been then succeeded subsequently by regulation in some places. If you take the cars and CO2 legislation, it was a voluntary agreement by the automotive manufacturers. For every year you had monitoring, you showed the results, you showed that the results weren't sufficient for the objectives. The political capital grew, and then you had the cars and CO2 legislation. So I think there it works fine, and I think experimentation is important. And sometimes regulators just aren't ready to regulate; they need the knowledge. So I'm not against voluntary agreements at all, and I think they're very important, also to help the vanguard really prepare their way. But they shouldn't be the end game; they should be a sort of a bridging function, and it should be as part of a wider policy mix. I can't remember which of the panelists talked about policy mixes, but it has to be together with the incentives, the regulation, the voluntary approaches, and all together. So I'm not against them. I just think we can't assume they will do too much, because then we'll actually, fail.
Yes, thank
and
you.
If they succeed,
Yeah.
if they succeed, fantastic. Just to be clear, it's not an ideological position.
Yes, yeah. We are getting close to the end of our discussion here. There has been one more question coming up from the audience, where they ask what happens if today's regulators get it wrong. And I will give the word to Lorenzo and Alexandre to just give a short comment on this. What might happen if they get it wrong? And then I will ask maybe one more question and we'll see. So Lorenzo, you also raised your hand, but any comment need to be very short.
Very short. Thank you. No, I was just chipping after the comments by Patrick and Fatma. It brings me to the point that we have addressed or raised the issue of impact assessment, which is very important. But here, when we're talking about looking at what has worked, what has not worked, what can we change, ex post evaluation is very important. And exactly these elements of the ex post evaluation, which is drawing lessons from the experience, not only checking whether a legislation has been effective or not, is important, but also how can we learn from the assumptions that we have, that regulators have put down. Have they worked? What are the negative consequences, and what has industry, for instance, done in terms of being part of the solution and advancing on this. And this is something that the Refit platform, for instance, the Fit for Future platform could start looking at more extensively, in my opinion.
That's actually an interesting point that no one made before, the importance of evaluating those regulations that were put into place. Alexandre, please comment what is the worst case scenario if we get it wrong?
Yeah. And by the way, I was the one mentioning the green public procurement because I think this is very much linked to the consumers and the carrot, and this is key. I think, the risk, this is kind of an innovation leakage. We did a survey a year ago where we were asking companies across different sectors, Europe, investing in Europe, investing outside of Europe. 9 out of 10 were saying they are willing to invest outside of Europe these funds for research innovation. And this is what we should avoid. And if we get it wrong, this is the risk we have.
Thank you very much. We received also a question here about the green transition and the need for it to be socially fair and leave no one behind, and not only focus on the environment and the economy. So that might be a very good last question, because we'll take into account the third aspect of sustainability that has been mentioned by a few of you, but has not been the main focus of this discussion. So Henna, do you want to comment on this?
Yes, I think this is very important comment, because now we are very much, when we speak about sustainability, we are focusing to environment and especially to climate. And I think it's always important to remember also the social and economic aspects when we are making decisions, because otherwise they will be not sustainable. Because it's true that they have to be socially sustainable, but also economical sustainable. There has to be also a business case for industry. Otherwise, it's not sustainable as a whole. So I think this is very important comment on all these three aspects. We should have always them with us when we are making decisions.
Thank you. And Thomasine, I give the word to you as well here, if you want to give a short comment on this.
Thank you. So I think that's exactly right. I mean, when you talk about sustainability, as I said at the beginning, it is about environment, social, and governance, and it goes hand in hand. And it's, again, goes back to the comments we've made around the life cycle assessment, the impact assessment, and really looking at what consequences happen as a result. And these are economic as well as social environment. It doesn't make things easier. If I can just go back to what happens if we don't get this right, we've lost an opportunity to get it right. So we have, because of perhaps the pandemic, we have a reset. We have a green economy recovery. We have very stringent ambitions and hard ambitions. Better regulation can help us get there. And I think that's the price. If we don't get it right, we won't get it right for society and ourselves.
Thank you, and thank you all so much for this discussion. We have been talking about how to achieve the Green Deal and the ambitious objectives that the European politicians has set up for all of us to work towards. And how can we do this in the best way, and how can we do this in a way that both supports the environmental and green transformation, of course, but also at the same time take into account all the different potential impacts this would have for citizens and industry, and how to make it more evidence-based, more transparent, with the possibility for everyone to give their opinions to the decision makers, and also make it more innovation driving in the end, so that we would have a better regulation, so to say, in the end, and how to achieve this. So it's been a really interesting discussion with both examples of how it sometimes does not work today, but also examples of how it can be made better for the future. So thank you everyone for listening, and thank you everyone for participating. And don't forget to also check out the Think Circle website, where you can read the interviews with the participants. So very nice to be here, and very nice to have everyone here, and hope that you had a good time. Thank you very much.